Before I start, you need one piece of context because this isn't a spooky getaway story and it isn't about bad luck. It's about what can happen when you try to disappear for a few days and things don't go the way you expected. Some places don't feel quiet the way you expect. They feel tense. And when you choose isolation on purpose, it can feel like the place itself is pressing back. Even now, I can't fully explain how it unfolded, only that once it began, it moved fast. And it happened last year. I was 22, running on fumes, dragging myself through work like I was watching someone else live my life. Everything felt distant, my routine, my friends, even my own thoughts. I'm not going to lay out my history here, but I'll say this. I'd made choices that left a few loose ends behind me. By that point, I wasn't chasing adventure or a fresh start. I just wanted space, real space, between who I was trying to become and the parts of my life that still felt too close. Hey, before we go any further, if you like slow burn stories where the details matter, take a second to subscribe and stay with me, because this is where things start to shift. What I needed at that point wasn't a vacation, it was distance. The kind where your phone stays quiet, your name isn't spoken, and no one knows where you are unless you tell them. I must have been letting that frustration show because one afternoon at work, a co-worker mentioned a place that immediately caught my attention. It was a small island off the coast of Maine. So quiet, he said, that most people visited for a few hours and left before evening. No nightlife, no crowds, no distractions. Once the last ferry pulled away, the island practically emptied out. The way he described it, the place sounded less like a destination and more like a blank space on the map. After dark, there were barely any lights, barely any movement, just ocean, wind, and silence. He even joked that if you stayed overnight, it would feel like the entire island belonged to you. That was exactly what I wanted. That same night, I looked it up. It didn't take long to find a listing for a small rental, a standalone cottage sitting alone near the shoreline. No neighbors close by, no shared walls, just one structure facing open water. It felt isolated, quiet, out of the way. And without thinking too hard about it, I booked it. Looking back now, that decision felt less like planning a trip and more like stepping off the grid before I realized who else might notice I was gone. The price should have made me hesitate. It was far lower than anything else on the island, and the place was available almost immediately. Normally, that kind of thing raises questions, but I wasn't in the mood to question anything. I wasn't thinking about risks or red flags. I just wanted out, so I booked it without a second thought. When I arrived, the cottage was exactly what the listing promised, and somehow even more isolated than I expected. It was small, barely more than a single open space with a bed, a compact kitchenette that looked like it hadn't been used in years, and a bathroom so tight it felt like an afterthought. The structure sat a short distance back from the shoreline, but what stood out most was everything around it. Dense brush surrounded the building on three sides, thick enough that it pressed close to the walls, cutting off any clear view of what was beyond it. The only open side faced the ocean. There was one window at the front, covered by a thin curtain that filtered the light but didn't really hide anything. During the day, it let the outside in. At night, I realized it would probably work the other way around. Inside, every sound carried. The walls were so thin that when the wind moved through the brush, it didn't feel distant. It sounded like something shifting right outside, air close enough to touch. Then there was the door. It had both a deadbolt and a chain lock, and they looked newer than everything else in the cottage. Not worn, not weathered, recently installed. For a place that remote, that detail felt out of place. I noticed it. I just chose not to think about why it might be there. I caught the last ferry over that afternoon and spent the first few hours doing exactly what I came there to do. Nothing. I walked the length of the island, slow and aimless, and letting the noise in my head fade with the sound of the water. What stayed with me, though, was how quickly the place emptied out. One by one, the day visitors lined up at the dock and headed back to the mainland. Conversations faded, doors closed. By the time the sun dropped low over the water, the island didn't just feel quiet, it felt abandoned. No traffic, no background noise, no streetlights flickering on, just wind, waves, and long stretches of empty space. At first, It was exactly what I wanted. The silence felt clean, peaceful, like I'd finally stepped outside of everything. I stopped at a small pub near the ferry landing for dinner. The place was nearly empty, just a few locals and the bartender behind the counter. She was friendly enough until I mentioned where I was staying. The change was subtle, not fear, not concern, just a brief pause and a look that lingered a little too long before she forced a polite smile and changed the subject. I told myself I was reading into it. On the walk back later that night, I took the shoreline path toward the cottage. About 100 yards away, tucked into a narrow rock opening, I noticed a small dock hidden inside a shallow cave. There was only one boat tied up there, a blue motorboat, small, clean, and out of place. Every other vessel I'd seen on the island had been large lobster boats, old and weathered from years of use. This one looked different, newer, private. I slowed for a second, just long enough to take note of it. Then I kept walking. By the time I reached the cottage, it was fully dark. I locked the deadbolt, slid the chain into place, and told myself the isolation was exactly what I'd come for. At that point, the quiet still felt like peace. I didn't realize yet how different silence can feel. Once you start wondering who else might be out there with you. Up until then, the quiet had been exactly what I came for. No messages, no calls. Why no distractions pulling me back into everything I was trying to step away from. But that feeling didn't last. When I went to plug in my phone, nothing happened. I checked the cable, switched outlets, tried another one across the room, then another. Every socket in the cottage, still nothing. For a minute, I told myself it had to be the charger. Then I realized the battery was already low and dropping fast. Within an hour, the screen would be black. Technically, it wasn't a real problem. I had a physical ferry ticket for the next day. I didn't need GPS. I didn't need directions. But standing there in that small, isolated cottage, the idea of being completely cut off felt different than I expected. Out there, a dead phone didn't just mean inconvenience, it meant silence, with no way to reach anyone if something went wrong. Still, I was exhausted. The past few weeks had finally caught up to me, and the quiet, the ocean air, the long walk, it all settled in at once. So I told myself it didn't matter. I set the phone aside, turned off the light, and lay down. And within minutes, I was asleep, completely unaware that the silence I'd been looking for was about to change. Sleep came fast, heavy and deep, like my body had been waiting for the chance to shut down. 1 minute I was staring into the darkness, listening to the wind outside, and the next, everything was gone. I don't know how much time passed before I woke up. There was no loud noise, no sudden movement, just that strange feeling, like something had changed and my body noticed before my mind did. And then I heard it, gravel shifting, slow, close, right outside the cottage. At first, my brain tried to place it somewhere else, maybe along the path, maybe near the brush. But the sound didn't move away. It stayed right in front of the door. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't walking past. They were pacing. Each step came with a long pause in between, like the person was taking their time, listening, waiting. It didn't sound like an animal. There was weight to it, intention. I shifted slightly in the bed, barely moving at all. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It wasn't empty. It felt aware, like whatever was outside had heard me move, and was now standing still, listening back. I didn't sit up. I didn't breathe any louder than I had to. I just stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it had been an animal, maybe the wind. Maybe I was still half asleep. The quiet stretched on long enough that I almost believed it. And then, after several long minutes, the footsteps started again. This time, there was no doubt about it. The sound wasn't drifting past. It was coming straight toward the door. Each step grew clearer, heavier, until it stopped just inches from the entrance. Whoever was outside wasn't wandering. They had walked directly to the cottage and stopped exactly where the door was. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure it could be heard through the walls. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Every instinct told me to stay completely still. Then a beam of light suddenly cut through the darkness. A flashlight. It swept across the front window and spilled through the thin curtain, moving slowly, deliberately, like someone was checking inside. I froze. The light clicked off. A second later, the door handle moved. I squeezed my eyes shut, listening to the metal strain. The deadbolt held. The chain didn't move. For a moment, everything went quiet again. I thought that might be enough. It wasn't. The handle turned again, harder this time. Then the first hit came, sharp and heavy against the door. Then another, and another. Each impact echoed through the small cottage, loud enough to make my whole body jolt. Whatever calm I had left disappeared. This wasn't someone lost. This wasn't a mistake. Someone was trying the door. That's when the fear turned into something more focused. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could and moved toward the door, crouching low behind it. I don't even know what my plan was. I just knew I didn't want to be standing in the open if the lock gave out. The pounding stopped. Silence again. I stayed there, crouched, barely breathing, waiting for the next hit. Instead, a voice came from the other side. Clear, calm, close. I know you're in there, Leo. For a split second, the shock almost made me respond. But I caught myself. I didn't recognize the voice, and I had never told anyone on that island my name. The footsteps moved away from the door, slow and deliberate, crunching across the gravel as they traced along the side of the cottage. I followed the sound as it passed the wall near the bathroom, then continued around toward the back. He wasn't leaving. He was circling. And the worst part wasn't the footsteps. It was the certainty that whoever was outside didn't just find the cottage. He knew exactly who was inside it. I stayed crouched there, barely moving, listening as the footsteps continued their slow path around the cottage. They didn't rush. They didn't leave. They just kept circling. I lost track of time. It could have been 20 minutes. It could have been an hour. When you're sitting in the dark, waiting for someone outside to make their next move, time stops working the way it should. Every few moments, the gravel would shift again somewhere along the walls. Front, side, back, then quiet, then movement again. It felt deliberate, like whoever was out there wasn't trying to get in anymore. They were letting me know they were still there. At one point, the waiting became worse than the fear. Part of me almost wished the door would give, just so the uncertainty would end. The silence between each pass was unbearable. Every second stretched, heavy, and tense, like something was about to happen but never did. And then, the footsteps stopped. Not faded, not moved farther away. Stopped. For several long seconds, there was nothing. Then from the direction of the shoreline, I heard it. An engine turning over. Small, mechanical. Close enough that I recognized the sound immediately. An outboard motor. I didn't move. I just listened. The engine idled for a moment, then grew louder as it pushed away from the dock. Slowly, the sound drifted farther and farther out across the water until it blended into the distance and disappeared. Whoever had been outside the cottage hadn't come from the island. They had come by boat. I didn't sleep after that. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in the dark, listening to every sound the wind carried, waiting for the engine to come back. It never did. The moment the sky started to lighten, barely enough to see the ground outside, I unlocked the door and stepped out. In the morning, the ground confirmed what I had spent the entire night trying not to believe. The gravel around the cottage was marked with deep, heavy footprints. Large boot prints pressed clearly into the surface. They formed a full loop around the building. Then another and another. Whoever had been out there hadn't just walked up to the door. They had circled the cottage multiple times. I followed the trail as far as I could. The prints didn't wander. They didn't stop anywhere else. And they moved in a straight line away from the cottage, cutting through the path toward the shoreline. And they ended exactly where the water began, no doubt about it. The person who came that night hadn't been staying on the island. They had arrived by boat, and they had come directly to that cottage. The rest of that day felt unreal. I packed without thinking, returned the key, kept my head down, and caught the first ferry back to the mainland. I don't remember much of the ride home. I just remember the feeling that something had crossed a line I didn't understand. Because here's the part that still doesn't sit right with me. That person didn't stumble across the cottage. They didn't get lucky. They knew where I was. They knew when I'd be there. And somehow, they knew my name. A few days later, I went back to the co-worker who had told me about the island. I asked him directly if he had mentioned my trip to anyone else. He didn't hesitate. He swore he hadn't told a single person, and the look on his face when I explained what happened, it wasn't defensive. It was scared. I believed him. I mentioned earlier that my past wasn't exactly simple. I won't get into the details, but there were periods of my life where I wasn't careful about who I trusted or what situations I put myself in. So the idea that someone, somewhere, might still have a reason to look for me, that part didn't completely shock me. And what I can't explain is everything else. How did anyone know I chose that island? How did they know which rental I booked? How did they know the exact night I'd be there? And the question that bothers me the most, how long had someone been watching before I ever got on that ferry? I never found any answers. I still work the same job. I still live in the same place. On the surface, everything went back to normal. But after that night, I stopped believing the situation was over. Well, because if someone was able to find me once, there's no reason to assume they couldn't do it again. If this story had you scanning the shadows a little harder, tap like and subscribe if you want the next one, because this is where the pattern starts to repeat. Years before the night on the island in Maine, something else happened to me. Something I still think about more often than I'd like. At the time, I was a structural engineer finishing my graduate research. My work focused on how concrete breaks down in harsh coastal environments. It wasn't exciting, and most people would probably find it painfully technical. But that research ended up taking me somewhere I never expected. To Japan. I had traveled to Nagasaki for a small academic conference, where I finally met a professor I'd been exchanging emails with for months. His name was Dr. Yamamoto, and his specialty was the study of abandoned industrial sites, places where entire communities had once existed and then simply stopped. During one of our conversations, he mentioned a location that immediately caught my attention: Hashima Island. Through connections I didn't fully understand, he arranged something rare, a special research permit that allowed me access beyond the restricted tourist areas. At the time, I was excited. Looking back now, and I realize I should have paid more attention to the tone he used when he told me how difficult that access was to obtain. If you've ever seen photos of Hashima, you know how it looks. From a distance, it resembles a concrete battleship sitting alone in the ocean, its surface packed with decaying apartment blocks and crumbling structures. Decades ago, it was one of the most densely populated places on Earth, built around an undersea coal mine. When the mine closed in the 1970s, everyone left, and no one ever came back. Today, the island is preserved as a historical site. Visitors are allowed to land, but only along a narrow reinforced path near the seawall. The interior buildings are considered unstable and dangerous. Entry is strictly prohibited, except for researchers. Before my visit, I had to sign a thick stack of liability documents, pages of warnings about structural collapse, falling debris, and restricted zones. At the time, it felt like standard procedure. Now, and I remember how many times the risks were emphasized. Early the next morning, I boarded a small boat arranged through the research office. It wasn't a tour vessel, just a compact transport carrying 2 people. Me and my assigned escort, a quiet man named Tishi. He spoke very little, which I didn't think much about. I was too focused on what I was about to see. As the boat approached, Hashima played a strange trick on my perception. From far away, it looked small and almost unimpressive. But the closer we got, the more the scale revealed itself. The sea wall rose like a fortress around the entire island. Behind it, layers of concrete buildings stacked tightly together, dark windows staring outward like empty eyes. Photos hadn't prepared me for the feeling. It didn't look abandoned, it looked paused. At the dock, Tishi gave me a briefing. I was allowed to enter several structures beyond the normal visitor route, but the rules were strict. Stay on designated paths. And avoid any area marked with red tape. Do not remove anything. Do not touch anything unless necessary. And one instruction he repeated more than once: stay where I can see you. I was also required to wear full protective gear, hard hat, reinforced boots, heavy work clothing that made movements slow and awkward. At the time, I thought the precautions were about unstable buildings. Later, I started wondering if some of the rules were there for a different reason. For the first few hours, and everything felt exactly the way I had imagined it would. Even with the heavy gear slowing me down, I was completely absorbed in the work, photographing exposed structures, documenting cracks, studying corrosion patterns. It was quiet, focused, almost peaceful in a strange way. The kind of environment where the outside world fades and all that exists is the space in front of you. Tishi stayed nearby, but not close. He kept his distance, checking his watch more often than the buildings around us. Like he was counting down the time until we could leave. Around midday, we entered one of the larger residential blocks near the center of the island. The stairwell was still standing, but barely. Portions of the concrete had broken away, and through the gaps in the landings, I could see straight down to the floors below. It wasn't exactly reassuring. Tishi stopped at the ground level. That caught my attention. He had been very clear earlier about keeping me within sight. But now he stayed behind and motioned for me to continue alone. I assumed he just didn't want to climb the unstable stairs. At the time, it didn't feel important enough to question. By the time I reached the fourth floor, I was focused on a section of wall where the outer concrete had completely separated from the steel reinforcement underneath. I was documenting the damage when something else pulled my attention. The dust. There was dust everywhere, thick, untouched layers built up over decades. Except for one area. Cutting through the hallway was a narrow path where the dust was disturbed, like it had been walked through repeatedly. Not recently. There were no fresh footprints, but the surface didn't look settled either. It looked used. I followed the line with my eyes. It led to a room at the far end of the corridor. The smart move would have been to go back downstairs and tell Tishi, but curiosity won. Carefully, I walked down the hall and pushed the door open. The moment it moved, I noticed two things. The first was the smell. It wasn't decay. It wasn't mold. It wasn't anything I could identify. It didn't smell natural, and it didn't smell like something people normally produce either. The closest thing I can compare it to is a space that hasn't been empty for as long as it should have been. The second thing was harder to explain. When I touched the wall, it was warm. Not hot, but noticeably warmer than anything else inside the building. For a few seconds, I just stood there trying to make sense of it. Maybe the sun had heated the exterior surface. Maybe the structure trapped warmth somehow. That explanation sounded reasonable, except there were no openings above, and the rest of the building felt cold and lifeless. And as far as I knew, there were no animals living on Hashima. I went back down and told Tishi what I found. His reaction was immediate and strange. He didn't ask where the room was. He didn't ask what the smell was like. Well, he didn't ask to see the area. He just shook his head and told me what I described wasn't possible. No people, no animals, he said. When I insisted he come up and check it for himself, he refused, flatly. That was the moment something shifted for me. The island didn't feel empty anymore. And as we continued moving through the buildings, I started paying closer attention. Because once you start looking carefully, you begin to notice things that don't belong. The more buildings we entered, the more I started noticing small things that didn't fit. Nothing obvious. No personal items. No clear signs of someone living there. But there were disturbances. Marks where debris had been shifted. Areas where dust looked uneven, like something had brushed against it. Narrow spaces between rubble that seemed too consistently cleared to be random. Not enough to prove anything, but enough to make the place feel less abandoned than it should have been. What bothered me most was that I couldn't tell what had caused it. It didn't look exactly human, but it didn't look natural either. At one point, after spotting another area where the dust looked recently disturbed, I pointed out to Tishi. He didn't answer. He didn't even look at what I was showing him. Instead, he reached for the radio clipped to his belt and spoke into it quickly, his voice low but urgent. Rapid Japanese I couldn't understand. When it was the first time he had used the radio since we'd arrived on the island. That was when the tension really started to build. When he finished, I asked who he was talking to. He didn't meet my eyes. Just checking the schedule, he said. The explanation didn't match the tone, and there was no one else scheduled to meet us out there, at least not that I had been told. I thought about pressing him for more, But the situation was strange enough already. Hey man, I didn't want to push the one person who controlled my way off the island, so I let it go. But after that moment, the atmosphere changed. Tishi stayed closer. He watched the surrounding buildings more than he watched me, and every time we entered a new structure, I couldn't shake the feeling that the island wasn't just empty ruins anymore. It felt like a place where something might still be moving, just out of sight. By that point, and it was starting to feel like Tishi understood more than he was willing to say, we made our way toward a taller residential block near the center of the island. As we approached the entrance, he slowed down. Then he stopped completely. For several seconds, he just stood there, staring into the dark opening. That caught my attention. All morning, he'd seemed impatient, almost bored. Now suddenly, he looked alert, careful, like he was listening for something before deciding to step inside. I should have taken that as a warning. Instead, I walked in. The stairwell was narrow and dim, but stable enough to climb. We went up several floors, 4, maybe 5. This time, Tishi stayed close behind me, which felt like a complete shift from how he'd been acting earlier. At the top level, I stepped into a corner apartment, and that's when I saw it. Against one wall was a small pile of blankets. Next to it were several empty plastic water bottles. They weren't old. They weren't weathered. Oh, they didn't belong to a place abandoned for decades. Someone had been staying there. Not years ago, recently. For a moment, I just stared, trying to process what I was looking at. Then I turned, ready to call Tishi over. There was no way he could dismiss this. But when I stepped back into the hallway, he was gone. At first, it didn't even register. I assumed he had stepped into another room or moved toward the stairs. Then the silence hit me. The building wasn't just quiet. I was alone. And suddenly, the blankets in that room didn't feel like evidence anymore. They felt like a warning. A cold wave of panic hit me all at once. My hands started shaking inside the gloves. My skin felt like it was crawling under the heavy protective gear. I turned and headed quickly back toward the stairwell we'd come up. Except when I reached the landing, the stairs were blocked. A large section of broken concrete and debris had collapsed across the path, completely sealing it off. There was no way through. I didn't stop to figure out whether it had fallen naturally. I just ran. I turned back down the corridor, moving fast, scanning for another exit. The layout suddenly felt confusing, unfamiliar. Every hallway looked the same. Every doorway opened into darkness. I didn't care about safety anymore. I didn't care about unstable floors or falling debris. I just needed to get out. That's when I heard it. Movement behind me. Footsteps stepping out into the hallway. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, turning corners, moving faster, my breathing loud inside the helmet. The building felt like a maze and panic made it worse. I couldn't think clearly. I wasn't sure if I was moving toward an exit or deeper inside. And then I realized something that made the fear hit even harder. There wasn't just one set of footsteps behind me. There were several. More than one person was moving through that building, and they were moving in my direction. And after what felt like far too long, I spotted another stairwell. I didn't slow down. I grabbed the railing and rushed down it as fast as I could, barely keeping my balance. At that point, I wasn't thinking about research anymore. I was just trying to make it back outside before whoever was inside that building reached me. I don't remember most of the way out of that building. Just flashes, the sudden brightness of daylight after the darkness inside, the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven inside the helmet, my boots hitting the concrete as I ran across the open ground without looking back. I didn't slow down until I saw the dock, and he was there. Tishi stood beside the boat exactly where we had left it, calm, still, like he had never moved. That's when the fear turned into anger. I started shouting before I even reached him, trying to explain what I'd seen, the blankets, the blocked stairs, the footsteps, the people inside the building. The words came out fast, tangled together, louder than I realized. I even accused him of abandoning me, of knowing what was happening. At one point, I remember saying the rubble hadn't fallen on its own, that someone had put it there, that maybe he had. Through all of it, he barely reacted. No surprise, no concern, no questions. He just watched me. That was what made it worse. The complete lack of response. It didn't feel like he didn't believe me. It felt like none of this was new information to him. For a moment, a part of me actually hoped someone from that building would appear out in the open, just so he would finally acknowledge what I was saying, but nothing came. Eventually, when I ran out of words and breath, he spoke. "We're leaving." That was it. No explanation, no discussion, no attempt to address anything I had just told him, and somehow that scared me more than the footsteps inside the building. Because if he already knew something was wrong on that island, then it meant I had been walking into it from the start. The boat ride back to the mainland felt longer than the trip out. Neither of us spoke. I kept watching the shoreline disappear behind us, unable to shake the feeling that I was leaving something unresolved, something that hadn't finished with me yet. But we made it back safely, and the moment I was somewhere secure, the first thing I tried to do was report what I had seen. Because if there were people living inside those abandoned buildings, then Hashima Island wasn't empty after all. As soon as I had a stable connection back on the mainland, I reached out to the one person who could actually explain what had happened. Dr. Yamamoto. He was the one who arranged my access, the one who knew the site, the restrictions, the risks. If anyone could confirm whether there were unauthorized people on the island, it would be him. He never replied. At first, and I assumed he was busy, conferences, travel, academic schedules. There were plenty of normal explanations. I sent another message, then another. Nothing. 2 weeks later, I was back in the United States. Still no response. Emails went unanswered. Calls never returned. It wasn't just that he was unavailable. It felt like he had simply vanished. I tried reporting what I had seen through the appropriate channels, local contacts, administrative offices, anyone connected to the site. As far as I know, nothing ever came of it. No follow-up, no questions, no confirmation that anyone even took it seriously. And maybe that's the part that unsettled me the most. Not the footsteps, not the blocked stairwell, not the evidence that someone had been living inside those buildings. It was the silence afterward. Years have passed since that trip, and I still tell the story whenever someone asks about the most unsettling place I've ever visited. But what stays with me isn't just what happened on Hashima, it's what didn't happen after. The man who went out of his way to get me access, who had the connections, the authority, the influence, was suddenly unreachable. No explanation, no acknowledgement, nothing. Sometimes I think about what might have been going on there and whether he already knew. And sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed longer, asked more questions, pushed harder for answers. If I'd spoken the language, if I hadn't needed to leave so quickly, maybe I could have found out what was really happening on that island. Instead, all I have is the memory and the uncomfortable feeling that whatever was there was never meant to be explained. If you're enjoying these slow build stories where the details matter, hit subscribe and drop a quick comment. Just one word is enough. It helps more than you think. But long before Hashima, there was another night, more than a decade earlier, that taught me what it feels like to be followed by a place you can't explain. At the time, I was a history major, buried deep in my thesis. My research focused on abandoned institutional sites, places built for large populations that had been shut down and left behind. Old hospitals, isolation wards, rehabilitation centers. Not the haunted house version people like to talk about, but the real history behind why entire facilities were created and why they were eventually sealed off and forgotten. One location kept coming up in my research, North Brother Island. If you've never heard of it, that's not surprising. It sits quietly in the East River, technically still part of New York City, but it might as well be invisible, overgrown, deteriorating, and completely abandoned for decades. At one point, it housed a quarantine hospital. Later, it was converted into a rehabilitation center. Eventually, the entire island was closed to the public. As far as I knew, access required special permission, and even then, it was heavily restricted. I never planned on going there. That would have been illegal, and at the time the island was guarded closely enough that the idea didn't feel realistic anyway. But one night, while I was out with two friends, Jansen and Jesse, I made the mistake of bringing it up. I was frustrated, probably complaining about how slow my thesis was going, how much research I still had left. I started telling them about some of the locations I'd been studying, including North Brother. I didn't think much of it. Neither of them were history majors. I assumed the conversation would die out. Instead, they leaned in. Once they realized the island was sitting right there in the same city we were living in, their interest shifted from casual curiosity to something else entirely. Back then, the whole urban exploration scene had a certain appeal. Abandoned buildings, off-limit spaces, places most people would never see up close, and the idea of a completely empty island hidden in the middle of New York, that was exactly the kind of thing that pulled people in. At first, I laughed it off. Then I started thinking about it. After months of researching the place, reading old reports, studying maps, and writing about its history, the idea of seeing it in person started to feel less reckless and more justified. Not for thrills, not for a story, just to understand the space I had been writing about. A few weeks later, the three of us made a decision that seemed exciting at the time. We met near Berto Point Park in the Bronx late at night and kept to the quieter paths near the shoreline. We had 3 kayaks with us, and once they touched the water, there was only one direction left to go. And the launch point was one of the few stretches of shoreline where you could slip into the water without drawing attention. From there, the island was less than half a mile away, close enough to see, but far enough that once you pushed off, there was no easy way back. We brought more gear than we probably needed: flashlights, extra batteries, basic supplies, telling ourselves it was just being careful. The plan was simple: head out late, look around briefly, and leave before morning. At the time, it felt reckless in the best way. But the moment our kayaks touched the water and we started moving toward the island, the excitement began to fade into something heavier. There was no checkpoint, no one stopping us, no turning back unless we chose to. The city lights stayed behind us, and with every stroke of the paddle, the island grew darker and larger in front of us. By the time we reached shore, the reality of what we were doing had fully set in. Getting the kayaks onto land wasn't easy. The edge of the island was choked with thick reeds and tangled vegetation. We had to force our way through just to find a patch of solid ground where we could drag them out and hide them. Once we stepped inland, the 3 of us stopped for a moment without saying anything. It wasn't just dark, it was quiet, and not the normal kind of quiet. The Bronx was right there, less than a mile away. One of the busiest cities in the world sat just across the water. But standing there, he's surrounded by overgrowth and shadow. It felt like we had crossed into a place completely cut off from everything else. We switched on our flashlights and started moving inward. It didn't take long for Jansen and Jesse to realize the island was much larger than they'd expected. I had shown them maps, tried to explain it beforehand, but maps don't prepare you for how the place actually feels. Buildings appeared one after another as we walked, some partially collapsed, and others swallowed by vines and trees so completely that they barely looked like structures anymore. At one point, Jesse stopped and stared at a building where a full-grown tree had forced its way through the middle, splitting the structure apart from the inside. He said it looked like something from a post-apocalyptic game. He wasn't wrong. Nature hadn't just taken the island back, it was erasing it. The deeper we went, the more the place felt wrong. Not haunted, not dramatic, and just abandoned long enough that human presence felt like the unnatural thing. If you didn't know the history, you might have thought the island had been empty for 100 years instead of a few decades. We checked several of the more intact buildings, sweeping our lights across rooms filled with dust and debris. Most of them were exactly what you'd expect: empty shells, silent and untouched. Then inside one larger structure, Jansen found something near a doorway. A spray paint can, not new. But not ancient either. He immediately wanted to add something to the walls, and Jesse agreed. I told them it didn't feel right. This wasn't just an abandoned space. It was a place where people had lived, worked, and died. They pointed out the graffiti already covering the walls and argued that one more mark wouldn't matter. I didn't have the energy to argue, so I told them they could do whatever they wanted. I just wasn't going to stay and watch. That decision turned out to be a mistake. I moved deeper into the building alone, trying to focus on the layout, the structure, anything that would be useful for my research. But the farther I got from them, the more the atmosphere began to change. Because once the sound of other people fades away, an empty place stops feeling empty. It starts feeling like you don't actually know who or what might still be there with you. There's something that changes the moment you realize you're alone in a place like that. When you're with other people, even somewhere unsettling, your mind builds a kind of safety around you. Noise, conversation, footsteps. Those things keep your brain anchored. They tell you everything is normal. But once that sound disappears, the space starts to feel different. Bigger, quieter, too aware. I was moving down a long corridor inside one of the larger buildings, shining my light across cracked walls and empty doorways. From the layout, I'm pretty sure it had once been part of the old hospital complex. That's when I heard it. My name. Jesse's voice coming from somewhere ahead of me. The sound made me stop immediately. Even though I recognized the voice, it still hit me with a jolt. The hallway swallowed sound in strange ways, and for a second I couldn't tell exactly where it had come from. I started walking toward it, but after a few steps, something didn't feel right. For Jesse to be ahead of me, he would have had to leave Janssen almost immediately after I walked off, and then move quickly through a different section of the building just to end up in front of me. Possible, but it didn't make sense. The building was a maze of corridors and stairwells. There was no obvious reason for him to circle around like that. I slowed down. The hallway stretched out in front of me, doors opening into dark rooms on both sides. My light couldn't reach the far end. "Where are you?" I called out. The answer came back almost instantly, from a room just a few doors down on my left. "In here." The voice sounded close, calm, familiar, and for a moment, that familiarity pushed down the unease. I stepped toward the doorway. Looking back now, that was the moment everything started to feel wrong, because the closer I got, the darker that room seemed compared to the rest of the hallway. The doorway was darker than the hallway. That was the first thing I noticed. The corridor was already dim, but the room beyond the frames seemed to swallow the light completely. My flashlight barely pushed the darkness back more than a few feet. For a second I hesitated. Then I told myself the same thing I'd been telling myself all night, that this was probably Janssen and Jesse trying to mess with me. It wouldn't have been out of character, especially after I'd wandered off on my own. So I stepped inside. I raised the flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The light passed over empty floor, cracked walls, peeling paint. And then it stopped. Someone was standing in the far corner, facing the wall. For a fraction of a second, my brain tried to make it normal. One of my friends standing still, waiting to turn around and laugh. But the shape was wrong. Too tall. Much taller than either of them. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the light. Just stood there, completely still, its back to me, its head tilted slightly toward the wall. The silence in that room felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. That was the moment my body reacted before my mind could catch up. I yelled, not on purpose. It just came out. Then I turned and ran. I didn't try to be quiet anymore. I didn't try to think. I just ran through the hallway, shouting for Janssen and Jesse as loudly as I could, my voice echoing through the building. Every dark doorway I passed felt like something could step out of it. Every corner felt too close. I had the overwhelming feeling that if I slowed down, even for a second, something behind me would start moving. I found them near the area where we had separated earlier. The moment they saw me sprinting toward them, they didn't ask questions. They ran too. We didn't stop until we were back near the shoreline, where the kayaks were hidden. Only then did we finally slow down enough to breathe. I tried to explain what I had seen. At first, they didn't believe me. Honestly, I wouldn't have believed it either if the situation were reversed. It sounded like panic, like shadows playing tricks in a dark building. But I kept insisting, and after a minute, the way I was talking, the way I looked, started to convince them that I wasn't exaggerating. We didn't debate it after that. Whatever we had come to see, whatever curiosity brought us there, it wasn't worth staying any longer. We started dragging the kayaks back toward the water, and that's when all three of us heard it. At the exact same time, it started as a low sound behind us. At first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the brush, but then it came again, faint, but unmistakable. A long, strained moan, drifting out from somewhere deeper in the darkness of the island. It sounded like a woman, older, The kind of sound someone makes when they're hurt, or exhausted, or trying not to cry. It wasn't loud, but it carried, clear enough that all three of us froze at the same time. No one spoke. No one asked if the others heard it. We didn't need to. I could see it on their faces. The same realization hitting all of us at once. Whatever was making that sound, it wasn't far. My hands were shaking as we dragged the kayaks the rest of the way to the water. Every second felt slow, like the darkness behind us was getting closer, even though nothing moved. Once the boats were in, we didn't waste time. We pushed off and started paddling hard, putting as much distance as possible between us and the shoreline. The trip back felt endless. Every splash of the paddles sounded too loud. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the island was still there, silent, dark, watching. But eventually the city lights grew closer, and we made it back. The drive afterward was just a loop of the same conversation over and over. Each of us trying to piece together what happened, trying to explain the figure, the voice, the sound we heard at the shoreline, trying to turn it into something normal. But there was one detail I couldn't explain away, the voice that called my name inside that building. I know Jesse's voice. I've known him for years. The tone, the rhythm, the way he speaks. It's as familiar to me as my own. And what I heard in that hallway sounded exactly like him, except Jesse never left Jansen. He was with him the entire time. I've thought about going back over the years. Part of me wanted to see the place again in daylight, to prove to myself there was a reasonable explanation, but access to the island is even more restricted now. From what I've read, getting anywhere near it without authorization is almost impossible. And honestly, I'm not sure I would go back even if I could. I don't believe in anything supernatural. I never have. But I do believe this. It felt like we weren't alone on that island. Something felt close, just out of sight. Something that seemed to know my name. And whatever it was, it knew exactly whose voice I would trust. If you've ever had a moment that didn't make sense until much later, tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, like the video and subscribe, I'll be back soon.